Hello, hello. Happy, great. Hello. Apparently my Wi-Fi is like a little screwy. How is everyone this morning? We good? We're having a good Monday. Hope everyone had a good weekend. Yeah, I actually got to go to Charleston this weekend in South Carolina, and I've never been before, and I have to tell you, absolutely beautiful. Like, amazing little town. I thought it was going to be like more of a big city, but it actually was like this cute small little town. It reminded me so much of Savannah. There was like these beautiful big trees, and thanks so much, Basil. How are you? Yeah, so Charleston was where it was at. We had the most amazing like celebratory dinner at this place called Halls. And if you're ever in Charleston, 10 out of 10 recommend hitting it up. So, with all that being said, let's jump into elements of the scene so that I can give you guys all this juicy info. So, last week I had posted about like the elements of a scene and kind of like more the mechanical stuff. So like what makes a scene really good, What makes a scene something that readers want to keep reading? And I feel like one piece that it always starts, right, isn't Charleston just like the best? But like when we start with like elements of the scene, I think it's really important to define like what is your POV character's goal, right? So right off the jump, it's really important to know this because basically when we know what our character's goal is, it's a lot easier to create progressive complications throughout the scene that go right against challenging that goal, right? And that's what is really interesting. That's why there's drama. That's why there's tension. That's why readers like to keep on reading until they hit the climax of the scene, right? So again, define what the character goal is. Yeah, it spices the scene up, right? Like even just a small little moment of like conflict, right, can do wonders for a scene. And really just take it from like face value to something that like, ooh, like this is interesting now. Like I want to keep reading, right? So definitely starting off by identifying that character goal is so super important. But don't forget, all of the other characters in your scene have a goal too. So whether it's a sidekick, whether it's, the waiter that enters the scene, everybody has a goal going on, right? So this is also really important when it comes to subplots. So in a book that I was working on, my POV character had this one goal, but there was like kind of a love triangle as my subplot, right? So like those other characters involved in that, like romance triangle, they have goals also. So it's really interesting to see how like competing goals kind of like come up in a scene. And again, like just creates that juicy conflict, right? So the other elements of a scene that are really important are the inciting incident. And I think this was really important for me to touch on because like it's not just the incident that like kicks off the scene. And I know that when I was like talking about this on Facebook, there were some people that were like, well, you shouldn't always start like right in the middle of the scene, like also known as media res, like in media res, when you start a scene that's like in the middle of already going on. And that's not really what I mean by inciting incident. What I really mean by inciting incident is basically saying, okay, what is the incident that's going to set this scene up? Right? So like if your POV character is, struggling to like order food, like the inciting incident could be like them entering a restaurant, right? It just basically is something that sets up the scene. Kind of gives us that like, okay, what is the character goal? What's going on here? What kind of gets that scene rolling, right? So then after we have the inciting incident, it is really important to touch on those progressive complications. So again, we have our POV character has a goal, right? And these complications can be small or they can be big. But the idea is that as the scene goes on, these complications get a little bit more intense and hit a little bit closer to home, right? So if I take our silly example from earlier, like we're writing a scene about somebody being nervous to like go in and order food at a restaurant, right? And their inciting incident is like them walking in. Like what are things that could possibly like throw them off their game or get in their way, right? Maybe the thing that they normally order is taken off the menu. Not a big complication, but a complication nonetheless, right? So now our character has to make a decision. Okay, what do I do now? Do I get something, new? Do I say like, I'll leave and go get something I know I'm going to like? Like there's so many options that this character has. So like, what are they now? Right. And then maybe as he goes to order, he keeps getting interrupted, right? Yeah, Bill, like battle scene, great example, right? Because there's so many things that can go wrong in a battle scene, right? So if we're in a battle scene and our characters are trying to, obviously win a fight, maybe the first challenge is that like they lose their weapon. Maybe another challenge is like mentally they have a block about like hurting someone, right? Or maybe a block about hurting a woman. And maybe they come to find out that they're fighting a woman the whole time. So there are so many different complications that we can throw in, but the goal is to really like have them build on one another. So that like they start off like a little annoying maybe for our POV character, and they lead up to like our POV character having to make a really big choice, right? Like, so the apex of our complications is our climax. Oh, hey, James. How are you? Yeah, so the apex of all of our complications is our crisis, okay? So this is basically when our character says, okay, in your story, James, like maybe the crisis of this battle scene is your POV character has a very strong like moral code, right? Maybe they don't want to hurt women, they don't want to hurt children, and yet they have this duty to fight in this war, right? Maybe the apex or the climax of the scene is your person figures out that they're fighting a woman, right? And that goes against all of the values and beliefs that that person holds. So at that moment, the climax or the crisis is, does your character continue to fight that woman even though it goes against the values that they hold true? Or do they decide not to fight that woman, uphold their values, right? And then, they get punished in another way, right? Like they fell back on their duty, right? They're not going through with their duty to fight and win this war, right? So maybe there are, this choice that they have to weigh. What are they going to do? Are they going to fight or are they going to retreat, right? And that's the crisis. That's the moment where the reader is like hanging on by a thread, like, oh God, we have these choices. What choice is this POV character going to make, right? The climax is that character making that choice, right? So in your instance, James, like it's your character making that decision and saying, you know what? I can't hurt a woman. That goes against everything that I stand for. It goes against who I am as a person. And they decide to retreat, right? That is the climax. That decision making is the climax of your scene, right? And it's so important, right? So once that decision's made and your character makes that decision, then we see, okay, what is the resolution? So like your character decides to retreat instead of fighting. What's going to happen? Is he going to be punished for retreating? Is he going to be punished by his commander? Is he going to be, what's it called? What's the word I'm looking for? Is he going to be like shoved out of the military by his peers, right? The other people that are fighting. Maybe they hear about what happened, that he didn't go through with this fight. And so they reject him, right? They no longer want anything to do with him. They say, you're weak. You are not part of this war, right? So like there's all this stuff that could happen after the fact. So what are those fallout instances? That's our resolution, right? My wireless connection keeps going a little funky, but basically after they make that choice, the resolution is what kind of happens as a result of that choice, right? And when I spoke about this in my Facebook post, it's really like, okay, now how does that scene resolution? Yes, court-martialed. Exactly. That's it. So again, it's like, how is that resolution then spurring the events of the next scene? Right? So if he ends up being court-martialed, maybe the next scene is that court-martial scene where he's getting reprimanded for not doing what he was supposed to be doing, right? So we can see how this scene starts off maybe very innocently, builds up to this moment of choice that your character is forced to make. And then the fallout of that choice leads us into the next scene, which we love, right? So those are kind of the mechanics of a scene. Now, when it comes to mechanics, the mechanical stuff, what questions do you guys have? How to build up a scene, how to get to the climax? What questions do you have about like making the mechanics of a scene work for you guys? If you have a question, I guarantee there's somebody else that's going to watch this who also has a question, probably the same question. So definitely don't be shy, fire away. There's no bad questions, no silly questions. I'd love to hear. Is this helpful? Kind of like talking through this a little bit more? Because I know like when you read a post, you're like, this is great information, Lo, but like, what the heck? What am I supposed to do with this, right? So sometimes it's nice to have a space to like hear things talked out a little bit more, get things that are more specific for like your story. If we don't have any questions, I'll move on to some of the other elements because I wanted to sprinkle in some other little goodies for you guys. All right, questions going once, going twice. Sold. Okay. So we are going to keep pushing, and I'm going to touch on a couple elements of a really great scene, right? So like those were kind of the mechanics, right? How do we mechanically write a good scene? But then there's some other elements that are really important to kind of like sprinkle in here, right? So one of them I talked about a few weeks ago being dialogue, right? Dialogue is so important for your story, and it should be in most scenes. Readers don't necessarily want to read these like fat chunks of text on the page. So we need to figure out a way to layer dialogue into those like big, thick chunks of text just to break it up. It gives the reader's eyes a break. It lets them take a breath from all of the information that you're giving them. And if you can use dialogue to communicate a lot of the information in those big paragraph texts, even better. Readers love dialogue. They like monologues a lot less. I hear you. So Basil asked a great question. What would be a good list of things to put as a climax? I had mentioned that the decision could be considered as a climax of a scene. Is there things that would be considered a climax? So the climax is just your character making that decision. So like the crisis is them weighing their options, and it's really just dependent on like each scene and what the goal is and what kind of predicament that character is facing. So the crisis could be weighing like 5 different choices, right? Because like there's infinite choices that our character ultimately can decide on, right? Our story can go a million different directions. I like to keep it narrow by saying like, okay, how can our crisis relate back to like who our character is on the inside, right? Like the example I gave about ordering food, not that serious, right? But the example I gave with James, definitely a little bit more serious, right? Like we're now into way deeper shit. We're into his character. We're into his values, right? When we have crisis points in our story that go directly against like values that our character holds or, like their belief system, amazing juicy stuff, right? The climax is just them making that choice. So them saying, it's not worth it to hurt a woman. This is who I am as a person. I can't live with myself if I do this, so I have to retreat. That's your climax. A couple sentences. It doesn't have to be long and drawn out, but your reader definitely wants to know like what the decision is, and they want to see your character make that choice and weigh those options. Does that make sense? I hope it does. If it doesn't make sense, let me know. I want to make sure I answer your question. So I hope that helps. But yeah, so it doesn't have to be this super drawn out thing, but readers definitely want to see that choice being made because they're in that character's point of view. So to like have them weigh all these options and not say like, this is the choice I'm making, right? Your reader's like, wait, what happened? You're weighing all these choices. What choice did you actually end up making? So it's really just about keeping your reader up to date with like your character's train of thought, what they're thinking, and why they're choosing the things that they choose. Hope that helps. And this is actually leading into what I was just talking about with dialogue, right? So dialogue, as much as it can be spoken words, right? It can also be internal dialogue, right? So like thoughts, that internal monologue that characters have, right? That's really what we're hitting home on, when it comes to all of these things. Characters aren't always saying exactly what they're thinking, right? So your character might be saying one thing out loud, but thinking something totally different inside. So it's really important to have that internal monologue to kind of let the reader know, like, what is this character actually thinking? We're in this character's point of view, and we're experiencing things alongside this point of view character. So the reader doesn't really want to be like surprised by the decisions your character makes. They want to be able to kind of see them coming, even if, like they don't 100% see them coming. They want to know that they could have reread it and then seen it coming. But yeah, so dialogue definitely needs to be layered in there amongst your information, setting your, scene up, giving all that good, like, juicy background information that we might need to kind of like understand everything happening in that scene. But very good skill to kind of just layer that in there. And yeah, kind of breaking that up between, those inner thoughts and those external spoken words. And even if your character is alone, little tip, have them talk to themselves, right? Have them say stuff out loud, talk to no one. Maybe your character talks to their dog or their cat, right? Like, I talk to my dog. So, like, maybe that is the only dialogue that we get in a scene, and that's totally okay. But definitely try to be conscious and cognizant of having at least a little bit in pretty much every scene. External action, right? I think like this is normally the piece that writers are really good at, in my experience. It's some of the more internal stuff that we tend to have challenges with. But when it comes to external action, obviously, like, we want our characters to be doing something. So even in a slow scene, even in a more internal scene where the conflict isn't external, there's not like a battle going on, your character's not fighting anything or fleeing anything. They're not having like this outward confrontation, right? They still need to be doing something. They still need to be having external action, whether it's like strolling in a park or at a museum, right? We can give them things to do, and having that external action just makes the scene feel real, right? Oh, damn. That is quite the complication. That is quite the complication to have your character's head blown right off, James. I guarantee that wasn't his goal. So, yeah. So dialogue, we have internal monologue, we have the external action, right? The other thing that I want to touch on is polarity shifts in your scene. So this means that our scene should be shifting, right? So polarity shift is when we take a scene from like happy to sad or sad to happy, right? But polarity shifts can be a lot more complicated than that, right? So it's basically this idea that like throughout the scene, things are changing. So if our scene starts off sad, maybe there's like a bright, happy moment, and then it ends kind of on a negative note. So we kind of take the reader on this like up and down journey. But having those polarity shifts really help, like make all of the emotions that the reader is experiencing stand out even more, right? So like if our character starts off angry, grumpy, and we set the stage for that in the beginning, then when we have something great happen and our character is happy and excited, our reader can like follow along with that emotional, turn, right? And then at the end, if we wanted to end on a negative scene, we could, right? But those polarity shifts help kind of like differentiate the mood of the scene and kind of track, like this is something good that's happening, this is something not great that's happening. And obviously if our character is facing challenges, there's going to be moments of frustration, of doubt, of anger, of sadness, of loss, right? So like it's just about saying like, okay, how do I make sure that this scene isn't just like one note all the way through? Like it's not just depressing or it's not just happy. We need to throw some of these other emotions in there, because that emotional tie to a character is definitely what pulls readers like way deeper into the book. Because if it's all external action, the reader's gonna be like, this is all cool, but like, who is this character, right? If they can't identify or relate to the emotions that this character is going through, they're probably not going to identify with the book very much. So that is one piece. It definitely helps give your scenes a little zest, a little spice, right? Any questions about dialogue? Any questions about polarity shifts? How to, bring your story from like happy to sad, angry to joyful? just layering in those different emotions, right? Humans go through so many emotions in such a short period of time. It's good to have some different feelings layered in. Coolness. Coolness. Cool. Little thumbs up. Thanks, guys. The last little thing I wanted to touch on when it comes to elements of a great scene is stakes, okay? And this kind of ties into our progressive complications that I was touching on before. I have writer's block and trying to put a scene together. Yeah, writer's block is tough, man. So normally, James, what I do is like in a situation like that, I go through and I just outline these things. I outline what the character's goal is. I outline how the scene starts. And like even just put like a sentence or two in there, you know, like it doesn't have to be a lot when you're outlining, just a sentence. The character's goal is this. This is how it starts. Here are 3 points of complications that I want to write. What are the choices that he's weighing between? And then what choice does he make? And then what happens as a result of that choice, right? So I'll just do like a brief outline that way, James, and then kind of like go from there. If it's less of like how to like make this scene kind of like work for your story and more of like you're not sure which direction to take your scene, I would look a little bit bigger. So take a step back. We shouldn't really be looking at a scene level if that's the case. We should be looking more at like a sequence level or a plot level, right? So definitely check out my stuff on like when you're stuck. I have some resources that I can tag you in, James, so that you can go back through and see like, okay, what are some things we can do if we're stuck with writer's block and we don't know like where to take this next scene. I hope that makes sense. So James, try and zoom out a little bit. Sometimes if we're looking way too close, we're like, this scene, what is going on? We have to like say, okay, no. Where's our goal for this character to get to? Maybe at the end of a sequence, at the end of this act, and then we work backwards a little bit, okay? How can we get them to like this main conflict of the act and kind of go from there? But if you're trying to make a scene work and you have an idea for like a scene that's just like not coming together, definitely go through and outline those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, those 6 things. And a lot of those like elements of a scene, guys, I did not make up myself. This is actually a like kind of framework that I have used from Sean Coyne. He has done a lot of research on stories and he has a website called The Story Grid. And he actually came up with names for all of these things. So like I did not name these. The only thing that he doesn't touch on that I did add was your character goal. He doesn't explicitly state that in any of his resources, but to me, it's like the building blocks of a scene. You need to know what that is before you jump in and start writing. Basil, polarity shift, a great point. Yeah, I think so often when we're writing, it's so easy to like want to make things relatively easy for a POV character, right? And that's just to say like not every scene has to end on a negative note. Like our scene can start off happy. We encounter some challenges, some frustrations, some emotional stuff kind of like in the middle here. And then it ends happy too. But having that shift go from like positive to negative back to positive, that's what keeps readers kind of interested instead of having just like this one emotional note the whole way through. Especially, like I said, if our character is experiencing like any kind of complications or challenges for him to like get his way, there's going to be emotional stuff that happens, right? So it's really important to just like make note of what those shifts may be throughout your scene. Because sometimes without them, things just fall a little flat, right? Like you're like, ugh, I feel like there's more I can get from this scene, you know? And yeah, stakes are so important. Stakes, people forget it. I'm going to talk about Buffy the Vampire Slayer for a second because I am the biggest Buffy fan ever. So I did like a whole self-study on Buffy and the stakes in Buffy. So they do such a great job in that show of enhancing the stakes. So if we look at Buffy, there are stakes within each episode. So a lot of times in a Buffy episode, the stakes will start with like Buffy herself, right? she's in danger. So they're very personal. So she starts off as like, okay, maybe just this one person is in danger of being hurt. And then typically they go to like her group of friends. So the stakes will escalate so that her group of friends is now targeted, right? So now it's no longer just Buffy. Now it's Buffy and her friends. And then by the end of the episode, it's either the whole school is under siege or the whole town is under a new threat, right? So we can see as the episode goes on, those stakes increase. First, it's just Buffy. Then it's Buffy and her friends. Then it's the high school. And then it's the whole community. And then by the end of the season, guys, I'm totally going to ruin it for you. So by the end, the whole world is at stake, right? So Buffy has these stakes that are, you know, bite-sized in each episode. There's also stakes throughout the season, right? So season 1, you know, like the first threat is just like, you know, like against Buffy and her friends. Relatively low level kind of thing, right? As the seasons go on, though, more people become involved, more is risked, there's more to lose, but there's also more to gain, right? And without stakes, without having something to lose and something to gain, there's really no story, guys. Honestly. Like, if there's nothing for your character to lose and there's nothing for your character to gain, what is the point of the story? Right? So this is really important piece. And like I said, you know, stakes can be done on a scene level. They can also be done on a sequence level. So this is like a scene or a sequence of like 3 scenes that kind of all tie together. A lot of times, like, we'll use sequences to break up chapters, but sometimes you can slice a sequence right in the middle and have it be 2 separate chapters. But excuse me, that's a whole nother point. But the idea here is that stakes should grow throughout your scene, throughout your sequence, and throughout your story, okay? On a scene level, we want to make sure that we touch on, like, what are the stakes if this goes wrong? What are the stakes if maybe your character makes the wrong choice, right? Just touching on those things, like, every so often keeps them fresh in the reader's mind. Because, like, as we go on these journeys throughout our stories, it's really easy for the reader and the writer, both of us, to get caught up in, okay, like getting your character to the next place, getting them across this next accomplishment, getting them across this next finish line, right? But it's important for the reader to know, like, okay, as we're going through the story, what if they get caught? What's going to happen? What happens to the story? What happens to everything that this character has worked for, right? So these are really important things to touch on periodically throughout your scenes, throughout your sequences, throughout your stories, just to keep it fresh in the reader's mind, to let them know, like, hey, something bad could happen, right? Honestly, James, a chapter can have as many pages as you want. There's no rules about chapters. I've seen some chapters that are like a sentence or a paragraph, and I've seen other chapters that are 55 pages. So it's really, chapters are really to kind of like create tension and drama. And that sounds silly, but hear me out. So if we choose the right places to stop and start our story, it can, one, spur readers forward, right? Because we want to end a chapter in a very intriguing way so that the reader does not want to wait to start the next chapter. So sometimes that might mean, you know, starting a chapter and then cutting off like the last scene of that sequence and throwing it in the next chapter. It's all very strategic, and it's all meant to kind of just push the reader forward. Which is, again, why, like, I don't typically focus on chapters right away when I'm drafting a story. Normally in the first draft, I really focus on what are the scenes, what are the sequences, what are the acts, what are my beats that I'm supposed to be hitting in this story. So I kind of look at that framework first. Like I said, big picture first. And then, you know, chapters I kind of do last. I'll say, like, okay, what's the most strategic place to break up this scene or this sequence? You know, will this push readers to continue reading? Or are they going to want to put the book down and take a break here? We don't want them to put the book down. We don't want them to take a break. Hope that answered your question, James. Guys, this is all I got for you. Any other questions? I am at my half hour mark. I actually have to jump off to hit a meeting. This was great. Thanks for coming and hanging out with me. If you are someone who's watching the replay, definitely put any questions you have. I will circle back around to them tonight to make sure everyone's questions are answered. And I love you guys. Also, if you don't know, I am finishing up my enrollment for CWI. If you have reached out to me about your CWI enrollment, definitely let me know. Reach out to me via DM. I'm trying to get all my onboarding calls finished up this week, hopefully before tomorrow when the live classes start. So if you are interested in, let me know. Definitely DM me, definitely reach out. I'm glad this helped you guys. I'm glad to have you here. I love you. Thank you so much. And I will see you guys next time. Have a great week.